So let's take a look at marking and filing the dovetails for the front piece. So first thing I'm going to do is add, normally this is a job for layout fluid. However, since most woodworkers probably don't have access to layout fluid, we can use poor man's layout fluid, which is a Sharpie. And all I'm going to do is coat the surfaces that I need to mark with a nice black Sharpie coat. This way I can come in with a scriber and get a really clean mark thanks to those black areas. So you can see where the markings from earlier are. So this is the outer face and this is the top. Here's my front piece. So if this is the outside face, this is the top, then this front piece will go in like so. So now I'm going to line this up, and if in doubt, you would rather have the bottom of the front piece a bit proud of this surface here than shallow, because it's going to be easier to trim a little material off the front piece than to trim the entire sidewall. Okay? So just something to bear in mind, but you can get quite close. Okay? So once I've got that more or less where I want, all I'm going to do is a quick scribe line. You can use an awl if you don't have a good scribe. Okay. And then if you like, you can also use a square to put in a square line dropping down. And this initial base, that is the correct depth, so we're going to maintain that. We can clean it up a little if we want, but that's the correct surface height. So what we're going to do now is just come in with a flat or pillar file or whatever file you have, and we're going to just file the material off until we hit those. These happen to be angled at 10 degrees, which is what I build the primary dovetails to. Okay? So, I'm going to drop this down for the best possible work holding. And then I'm going to file to those lines. And we'll just pause and check. Okay. So I like where we're at on the lower. I'm just going to do one more stroke to get a nice, clean, straight line all the way down. And then I'm going to finish filing out to get the fit. That should be pretty close. There we are. Okay, that looks good. We want to check and make sure that it drops all the way down to the base. And I'm just going to hit inside each corner very lightly with my barrette file. And I'll try and clean up that bottom surface just a bit. Okay, and that side looks good. Now we still need to add a secondary dovetails, but we'll get to that in a minute. First, I'm going to add the same primary on the other side. So we'll just flip this. Again, we'll add some layout fluid. Okay, and we still have a little bit of waste material in here that I'm just gonna push off. Okay, and then we'll line up and mark, rinse and repeat, same as the other side. Okay, only now we still have the outside facing this way, but the top is to the right. Okay. I'm not going to bother at this point adding the vertical lines. My sense of vertical is generally pretty good, so I'm just going to trust my eye. Fairly close. I need just a little bit more off the bottom edge. And when I know I'm getting close, I tend to just hit the inside corners to remove any burrs in there, as they can trip you up sometimes. Okay. It's going to be awful close. Yep. Okay. So again, check the fit. That one dropped perfectly right to the base. Okay. Now we need to talk a little bit about secondary dovetails. Let's go back over to the surface plate for that. Okay, we need to talk for a minute about secondary dovetails, which is a concept that does not really come up in woodworking. It's not a joint that you can use in woodworking applications. But essentially what it is as we have right now, we have a dovetail joint that will hold that front piece from lateral movement, but there's nothing to keep it from sliding out. And what we can do is we can put in, it's actually sort of a faux dovetail in this direction. And if you look, you can make it out on these sidewalls down here. There's a sort of a triangular area. And all we're doing really is excavating a small bit of an opening that then we can peen into that will lock things in place. The typical way to put this in is we'll use anywhere between 6 and 10 degrees, and I have my trusty bevel gauge set for 10 degrees here. And what we want to do is mark in dovetails on this face. I'm going to sort of over mark these a bit so that hopefully they're easy to see. So if you can see, I've just sort of marked what I want, and this baseline is going to stay the same, but this small island of material in here, I'm going to remove. Now, I don't want to remove it all the way through. What I'm going to do actually is remove it at an angle. All right? So I'm going to mark the other side, and then we'll go back to the vise, and it'll be a lot simpler to understand from there. Okay, so we're back at the vise, and hopefully you can see the scribe lines I put in for these secondary dovetails. And this is where that barrette file, or your inexpensive file that you've filed acute edges on, and I'll do one with each of these, comes in handy. So the way this works is, I want to file to that line, which means I'm going to have to rotate my file to match that orientation to about 7 to 10 degrees. And rather than going straight back, I'm going to come back at an angle of anywhere from 20 to 30 degrees. Because I don't need this to go all the way through. I really just need it to go maybe a third of the way back through the material. Okay? So once I get the orientation I want, I'm going to take a few passes. And I'll look from the side and see what I'm getting. I'll do on this side so that you can get a better look. I'll do this one with our... So I rotated to that 7 to 10 degrees. And you should be able to see there is a triangle of material removed. So that now, when I peen this closed, some of that material is going to push into that gap, and it's going to keep this from moving in this direction or in a vertical direction. And so that's the purpose of the secondary dovetails, is to lock it in a second axis. And it's one of the things that is of endless fascination about infill planes, especially when people are first learning to make them or use them. Okay, and that's it. Those are done. They do not need to be executed to a high level of precision. They just need to have enough of a gap that you are able to fill and can fill, and that's filled enough that it will hold things in place. So that's one side. The other side, again, my markings are still there. That's a bit steep. That looks good. And note, the peak of this triangle, it does not need to go all the way up to the top. All it needs to do is peak at or above the top of this face. And really, even if it doesn't quite make the top of that face, it's fine. I've left quite a bit of extra material, and in the peening process, you'll see why. I've left more material, about double what I normally would, for peening these pins down later on, and so there's going to be no problem if your secondary dovetail does not reach all the way to the top. Okay, so now the dovetails for the front piece are in place. The only other thing we want to do is we're going to add just a bit of taper to the mortises for the bridge, and this is quite straightforward. Okay, you'll check the fit of your bridge, and again, if this is the outside and this is face up, then our bridge orientation is like this. What I'm going to recommend is that in this tapering, you leave this lower edge alone, and we'll consider that sort of a reference edge to keep the bridge height even from side to side. And we'll introduce just a little taper around the other sort of 3 edges, curved though they may be. And so in order to do that, we're going to use our rat tail file, and we'll come in, and so it's just as simple as, rather than going straight, we're going to taper it 10-15 degrees. And really very little material that you need to remove doing this, so don't overdo it. It takes very little, and in fact, if you did not even perform this step, I'm virtually positive your plane would still hold together just fine. Okay. So now if we put our bridge back in, you should be able to make out a bit of a gap. running around the outside. You want it just large enough to be a little bit visible and not much more. Okay. And we'll flip and rinse and repeat. Again, leaving this lower edge now on the right side alone. Okay, and we'll just double check our fit once again. Goes in nicely, and just a bit of a gap. All right, so that is, the sidewall is now, all of the joinery is prepped. The last thing to do is a bit of cleanup on the inner face, which is the one part in this that we're gonna have a difficult time getting to afterwards. The rear section at the middle here is not a show face. Okay, but the very front is also not a show face because an infill is in there. But this area in here you will see, and so now's a good time to clean it up because it'll be much easier to clean it up if it needs it now than later. And in fact, once I've cleaned it up, I typically will put some blue painter's tape over it in order to make sure that I don't damage it while I'm doing assembly. If you're going to use tape, the one thing that you need to be careful of is you want to keep the tape away from these mortises so that when you put the bridge in, you do not want the tape to be caught between the bridge and the sidewall because you will see it. Right? Okay, so this one's already cleaned up fairly well. What I'm going to do is just take one of these round rubber fids. Now, I would not recommend going too high. This is 320 grit paper. I wouldn't go to 600 or 800 grit because, frankly, the higher the grit, the more it's going to show any errors. Right? What does matter more is I try to keep a very linear stroke, okay? So that it looks like a brushed finish, say. All right? And again, the areas that I'm concerned with are really between my thumbs. And then I'll add a bit of tape. Leaving plenty of clearance. At the joints. Let's see, is that going to be... Okay, and that's going to clear our bridge just fine. Okay. Okay, so just a bit of protective tape, it'll make it easier to keep those areas clean. And the other way to do it is as such. Okay, and that'll be well out of the way. Now, the only other thing left to do is we need to mark a center line at the rear. We're going to use that to make sure we get a symmetrical bend. And if you look at the bending block, this is the way it gets placed, okay, upside down. And so you want to be able to see a midline mark on this top face. Now, you can do this any way you want. I tend to use dividers to just get a good midline. This is almost exactly 2 5/16, 2 3/8. Almost exactly 2 3/8 inches between dovetail to dovetail. Okay, so if we go 1 3/16 on either side and mark center, that will get us more or less there. Okay, so I just got a pair of dividers that I am going to use to find a center line. I'll just come over from that side and this side. You may not see it, but what I end up with is I've got 2 lines here, and I know that in between those 2 is dead center. So I'm going to mark that and then scribe it down the middle. Okay, so now I have a good clean mark for the center line. Okay, moving on.